Before we can understand the Easter Rising, we have to step back from the smoke, the rifles, and the ruined streets of Dublin, and ask a more important question. How does a people arrive at the point of rebellion? How does a nation, still unfree, begin to imagine itself into existence? Because the Irish Easter Rising did not erupt out of nowhere like a sudden spark in a clear sky. It came at the end of a very long storm. For centuries, Ireland had lived under British rule. That fact alone shaped nearly every part of Irish life. Politics, land, religion, language, education, law, power, all of it existed under the weight of that relationship. And for generations, that relationship had been marked not by equality, but by domination, resentment, rebellion, suppression, and grief. By the early 20th century, many in Ireland were no longer asking whether the country should govern itself. They were asking when. And just as dangerously, they were beginning to ask how. Now, there were different answers to that question. Some believed Ireland could achieve greater independence through constitutional politics. Through speeches, elections, negotiation, and patience. This was the world of Home Rule, the long-promised measure that would give Ireland limited self-government while still remaining within the United Kingdom. To many moderates, this seemed like the practical path forward. Frustrating, slow, and incomplete, yes, but better than bloodshed. But to others, Home Rule looked like a half-open door dressed up as freedom. And worse, it was always being delayed. By the early 1900s, Ireland had become a country caught between promises and fury. National identity was sharpening. Cultural revival movements were breathing life back into Irish language, literature, folklore, and historical memory. The country was not simply asking for policy changes. It was remembering itself. And that is often where empires begin to feel the ground shift beneath them. This was not merely political frustration. It was emotional. Spiritual, even. Many Irish nationalists believed that Ireland was not just a territory under foreign administration, but a nation with a soul, and that soul had been denied its full life. And in that atmosphere, a certain kind of person began to emerge. Not just politicians, but visionaries. Teachers. Poets. Labor organizers. Secret revolutionaries. Men and women who believed that speeches had their place, but history, real history, sometimes had to be seized with both hands. One of them was Patrick Pearse, a schoolteacher, writer, and fervent nationalist who saw Ireland not merely as a political project, but as something sacred. Pearse believed that nations were animated by sacrifice, by memory, by myth, by the willingness of the living to die for the unborn. He did not think in the cautious language of compromise. He thought in symbols, destiny, and flame. Then there was James Connolly, a very different figure. Connolly was a socialist, a labor leader, a man of the working class, deeply shaped by poverty, injustice, and the brutal realities of industrial life. Where Pearse spoke in the language of nationhood and sacrifice, Connolly spoke in the language of class, labor, and human dignity. And yet, for a brief and combustible moment, these two visions would stand side by side. And behind them stood figures like Tom Clark, one of the old revolutionaries, a man whose commitment to Irish independence had been hardened over decades, sharpened by prison and struggle. Clark was not the romantic face of the movement. He was something flintier than that. A man who had spent much of his life in service to the idea that Britain would never simply loosen its grip because it had been politely asked. So already, you can feel it, can't you? The tension. Not only between Ireland and Britain, but within Ireland itself. Between moderation and militancy. Between parliamentary reform and armed revolt. Between those who believed history could be negotiated, and those who believed it had to be forced open. And then came the great accelerant. World War I. When war broke out in 1914, Britain was suddenly consumed by a massive continental conflict. Troops, attention, resources, and political focus were pulled into the machinery of European war. For some Irish nationalists, this was not just a global crisis. It was an opportunity. England's difficulty, as the old phrase went, could be Ireland's opportunity. Now, that did not mean rebellion was inevitable. Far from it. Many Irishmen served in the British Army during the war. Many believed supporting Britain in wartime would strengthen the case for Home Rule afterward. Others saw the war as one more reason not to plunge Ireland into chaos. But for the revolutionary mind, the war changed the equation. An empire distracted is an empire vulnerable. A government under strain is slower to react. And a moment of world disorder can make once unthinkable acts suddenly possible. That is the world we are entering. A world where political patience is dying. A world where old grievances are mixing with cultural pride, wartime opportunity, and revolutionary conviction. A world where a handful of men and women begin to believe that even a doomed rebellion might accomplish something larger than victory. Because sometimes, in history, people do not rise because they expect to win. Sometimes they rise because they believe the act itself will echo. And in Ireland, in the spring of 1916, that echo was beginning to take shape. Not yet in gunfire. Not yet in smoke. Not yet in the shattered center of Dublin. But in minds. In meetings. In secret oaths. In old anger. In young idealism. In the growing belief that Ireland would not simply be granted its future. It would have to declare it. And that is where our story truly begins. So now that we understand the pressure building beneath the surface, we need to talk about the people who decided that pressure would not be relieved through speeches, parliamentary promises, or patient negotiation. It would be answered with rebellion. And this is where the story becomes both more human and more dangerous. Because revolutions are not born from abstract ideas alone. They are born from people. From personalities. From convictions so strong they begin to harden into action. By 1916, the movement for Irish independence was not a single, unified machine marching in perfect step. It was a crowded room of overlapping loyalties, competing strategies, private societies, political organizations, labor groups, cultural nationalists, and militants who did not always agree on the future, but increasingly agreed on one thing. Britain would not be moved by words alone. At the center of this growing conspiracy stood the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or the IRB, a secret revolutionary organization committed to establishing an independent Irish republic by force if necessary. It was not interested in merely reshaping Ireland's relationship with Britain. It wanted to break that relationship entirely. Inside the IRB, a military council quietly began planning an uprising. Not someday. Not in some vague future. But soon. Among the most important of these men was Tom Clark, the old revolutionary whose life had already been shaped by imprisonment and struggle. Clark was not interested in waiting for history to become convenient. He belonged to an older tradition of Irish republicanism, one that had long since stopped expecting fairness from the British state. He carried the memory of earlier failed rebellions like a live coal, and he was determined that the next effort, even if crushed, would burn brightly enough to matter. Then there was Sean MacDiarmida, one of the great organizers behind the scenes. If Clark was the hardened ember, MacDiarmida was the connective tissue, moving between men, plans, and circles of trust. He understood that revolution was not just passion. It was logistics, persuasion, discipline, timing. And then, of course, there was Patrick Pearse. Pearse brought something electrifying and deeply unsettling to the movement. He was not only a nationalist. He was a man who understood the power of theater, symbolism, and sacrifice. He believed that an act of rebellion, even one that failed in military terms, could awaken the moral imagination of the Irish people. Pearse saw history almost liturgically. He thought in terms of blood, redemption, memory, and nationhood. To him, rebellion was not simply a tactic. It was a declaration of identity. Standing beside him was James Connolly, and here the picture becomes even more remarkable. Connolly did not come from the same ideological place as Pearse. He was a socialist, a labor leader, and the head of the Irish Citizen Army, a smaller armed force originally formed to protect workers during the bitter labor unrest of the Dublin lockout in 1913. Connolly saw class oppression as inseparable from political oppression. For him, there was little point in swapping one ruling structure for another if the poor remained crushed beneath it. And yet, in 1916, Connolly and Pierce found common cause. That alliance tells you something profound about the Rising. It was not ideologically neat. It was not one clean stream of thought flowing in a single direction. It was a convergence. Nationalists, cultural revivalists, Republicans, labor militants, and idealists all moving toward the same precipice, though not always for exactly the same reasons. And then there was Countess Markievicz, one of the most extraordinary figures in the Rising. Born into the Anglo-Irish aristocracy, she could have remained comfortably within the world she was born into. Instead, she moved toward radical politics, Irish nationalism, and direct action. Her presence alone shattered assumptions about who rebellion belonged to. She was not a decorative figure orbiting great men. She was armed, committed, and fully inside the revolutionary movement. Now, if all of this sounds like an uprising gathering perfect momentum, let me stop you there. Because the road to Easter week was not smooth. In fact, it was full of uncertainty, division, and near disaster. One of the great tensions inside Irish nationalism was the divide between those who favored constitutional methods and those preparing for armed revolt. Many members of the Irish Volunteers, a militia formed in 1913, supported the idea of defending Irish rights, but not all of them were prepared to launch a rebellion in the middle of a world war. Some were more cautious. Some believed timing mattered. Some believed public support mattered. Some feared catastrophe. And catastrophe, to be fair, was not exactly a remote possibility. The rebels were not planning from a position of overwhelming strength. They lacked the numbers, equipment, and nationwide certainty that a successful insurrection would normally require. They were preparing to challenge one of the most powerful empires in the world with limited arms, uncertain coordination, and a population that might not immediately rise beside them. That is not boldness. That is boldness flirting with doom. So why Easter week? Part of the answer was practical. Britain was at war. Its attention was divided. Its resources were stretched. If there was ever going to be a moment to strike, this looked like one. But part of the answer was symbolic. Easter carries with it the language of death and rebirth, sacrifice and resurrection. For men like Pierce, that symbolism mattered. This was not simply a military operation scheduled into an empty calendar slot. It was an act meant to resonate beyond the battlefield. The timing itself would become chaotic. The rebels had hoped to coordinate a broader national rising, supported in part by arms from Germany, Britain's enemy in World War I. But the plan began to fray almost immediately. The German weapons shipment was intercepted. Confusion spread. Orders and counterorders tangled the movement in uncertainty. And this brings us to one of the most important and often overlooked figures in the story. Owen McNeill. McNeill was the chief of staff of the Irish Volunteers, but unlike the inner circle of IRB conspirators, he had not been fully committed to a symbolic suicidal rebellion. He believed military action should only be taken if there were reasonable prospects of success, or if the British moved first against the Volunteers. When he discovered the extent of the plans and the failures surrounding them, he issued a countermanding order calling off volunteer maneuvers for Easter Sunday. That single decision hit the Rising like a hammer. Plans collapsed. Numbers shrank. Confusion deepened. Men who might have mobilized stayed home. Communication faltered. What had already been risky now became even more uncertain. And yet, despite all of that, the core leadership pressed forward. Think about that for a moment. They knew the plan had been damaged. They knew support would be weaker than hoped. They knew the odds had worsened. And still they chose to proceed. This is the moment where history stops being merely strategic and becomes almost existential. Because from a purely military standpoint, pressing on looked irrational. But from the perspective of men like Pierce, Clark, and Connolly, delay carried its own danger. Momentum might vanish. Resolve might fracture. Another opportunity might never come. And above all, the act itself, the declaration, the rising, the refusal to submit quietly, may have seemed more important than the immediate outcome. They were not simply trying to win a fight. They were trying to create a moment that could not be ignored. A moment that would force Ireland, Britain, and the wider world to confront the fact that beneath the politics of empire, there remained a nation willing to bleed for its own existence. So as Easter week approached, what existed was not a unified national army poised for glorious victory. It was something messier. A secret plan weakened by confusion. A coalition bound together by conviction more than certainty. A rebellion already haunted by the possibility of failure. And yet, perhaps because of that very fragility, it took on an almost unbearable intensity. These men and women were no longer standing at the edge of theory. They were moving toward action. Toward risk. Toward history. Toward a Monday morning in Dublin when proclamation would become gunfire, and ideas that had lived in whispered rooms would step into the street in broad daylight. And that is where we go next. Easter Monday. The Republic declared. And so we arrive at Easter Monday, April 24th, 1916. The day the conspiracy stopped being a secret. The day plans became movement. The day a handful of rebels stepped out of the shadows and tried to force a republic into existence. Now, I want you to picture Dublin that morning. Not the Dublin of memory. Not the Dublin of monuments and commemorations. But the real city as it was then. A capital under British rule. Busy, imperfect, inhabited by ordinary people going about ordinary business. Shopkeepers opening for the day. Pedestrians moving through the streets. Horse carts rattling over stone. No grand sign hanging in the sky to announce that history was about to rupture. And then, slowly at first, the rupture began. Armed members of the Irish Volunteers, the Irish Citizen Army, and allied groups began moving into position across the city. Their numbers were not vast. This was not a tidal wave pouring through Dublin. It was something stranger than that. Sharp, deliberate movements. Columns of men and women entering key sites. Orders given. Windows watched. Doors secured. Barricades prepared. To the casual observer, it must have felt at first like confusion before it felt like revolution. One of the most important targets was the General Post Office, the GPO, on Sackville Street, now O'Connell Street. This was no random building. It stood at the very center of Dublin's civic life. To seize it was to seize not merely a structure, but a symbol. A nerve point. A public stage. And it was there that Patrick Pearse stepped forward and read the proclamation of the Irish Republic. This was the moment at the heart of the rising. The moment where rebellion announced itself not just with rifles, but with words. Pearse stood outside the GPO and declared the establishment of an Irish Republic, speaking in the name of God and the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood. It was a statement steeped in political ambition, historical memory, and almost biblical gravity. The proclamation named a provisional government and asserted Ireland's right to national freedom and sovereignty. It is one of the great ironies of history that one of the most important declarations in Irish history was delivered to a crowd that was, by many accounts, confused, unimpressed, or simply unsure what exactly was happening. Because let us be honest about this. The rising did not begin with the entire city surging joyfully behind the rebels. There was no universal roar of immediate support. Many Dubliners were bewildered. Some were irritated. Some were curious. Some were alarmed. Some likely saw this, in its first hours, as reckless disruption dropped into the middle of ordinary life. And that matters. Because we sometimes flatten revolutions into inevitabilities after the fact. We imagine that when a nation-changing event begins, everyone present somehow recognizes the script. Usually, they do not. Usually, history arrives looking disorganized. The rebels spread out across Dublin and took up positions in several key locations. Alongside the GPO, there were strongholds at the Four Courts, Jacob's Factory, Boland's Mill, the South Dublin Union, and St. Stephen's Green. This was not a total occupation of the city. It was a strategic attempt to hold important sites, disrupt British control, and create defensible positions from which the rebellion might spread. At the GPO, Pierce was not alone. Tom Clark was there, the old revolutionary now standing inside the very insurrection he had long imagined. James Connolly was there as well, bringing military discipline and hard resolve to the rebel headquarters. These were not dreamers floating above events. They were now inside them, committed beyond retreat. Elsewhere, individual figures gave the uprising its human shape. At St. Stephen's Green, Countess Markievicz and Michael Mallon helped lead forces into position. The image is almost cinematic. Rebels occupying a city park under the looming pressure of what they knew must come next. Markievicz, armed and in uniform, became one of the defining figures of the rising, not because she was symbolic decoration, but because she was present where danger lived. At Boland's Mill, Eamon de Valera commanded his position, one of several younger leaders whose later political importance would cast long shadows backward over the week. But on that first day, no one yet knew exactly how this would end. That uncertainty is crucial. For the rebels, Easter Monday was not merely the opening move in a battle. It was a wager. They were betting that a dramatic seizure of Dublin, joined to the proclamation of a republic, might ignite broader national support. They were betting that the symbolism of the act would magnify its military weakness. They were betting that Britain, distracted by World War, would struggle to contain the moment cleanly. And for a brief instant, before the full weight of imperial response came crashing down, they held the center of the stage. The Republic, though fragile and surrounded by doubt, had been spoken aloud. Now, there is another piece of this first day that deserves our attention. The mood. Because Easter Monday did not yet carry the full horror that later memory would attach to the rising. The city was tense, yes. There were bursts of fighting, confusion, interruptions, and signs of danger. But the true devastation, the artillery, the fires, the ruined streets, the collapsing positions, that was still coming. On the first day, there was still the strange atmosphere of suspension. A city trying to understand what it was seeing. A rebellion trying to become real before it could be crushed. A declaration hanging in the air before the consequences arrived in full. And there is something almost painfully human in that. Imagine the rebels inside those buildings. Some must have felt exhilaration. Some must have felt dread. Some perhaps still believed the country would rise around them. Others, I suspect, already felt the chill of isolation. Because even at the moment of proclamation, the rising contained its own contradiction. It was bold enough to announce a republic, but not yet powerful enough to guarantee one. Still, the act itself mattered. That is the key to understanding Easter Monday. Proclamation was not just a political document. It was an attempt to make Ireland visible to itself in a new way. To say, in public and by force, that Ireland was not merely a province to be administered, but a nation to be born. Whether the city accepted that claim immediately was another matter. Whether the rebellion could survive long enough to make the claim stick was yet another. But once Pierce read those words, something irreversible had happened. The old argument had changed. Ireland had not merely petitioned. Ireland, through these rebels, had declared. And once such a declaration is made in blood and gunpowder, it cannot be neatly folded back into ordinary politics. So Easter Monday closes not with resolution, but with tension tightening like wire. The buildings are occupied. The proclamation has been read. The Republic has been declared. And now the British Empire must answer. In the next section, we move into the city at war. The barricades. The gunfire. The strongholds. And the beginning of the destruction that would turn this rebellion from dramatic gesture into urban catastrophe. By the second day, whatever uncertainty had hung over Easter Monday began to harden into something far more brutal. This was no longer a startling declaration. No longer a dramatic occupation of buildings. No longer a strange interruption in the rhythm of the city. Now Dublin was becoming a battlefield. And this is the moment where the Easter Rising changes in character. What began as proclamation now becomes endurance. What began with words now must survive gunfire. The rebels have declared a republic, yes, but declarations are fragile things when an empire begins answering with rifles, machine guns, troop reinforcements, and artillery. Because Britain did answer. And it answered fast. At first, the British response had been uneven. There was confusion, underestimation, and the ordinary delay that often greets sudden unrest. But once the scale of the rebellion became clear, reinforcements began pouring into Dublin. Soldiers moved into the city. Positions were tested. Firefights intensified. Streets that had belonged to pedestrians and shopfronts just hours earlier were now spaces of ambush, panic, and death. The rebels, remember, had not seized all of Dublin. They had taken selected strongholds, hoping to disrupt British control and perhaps inspire a wider national rising. But that strategy came with a cost. Their forces were scattered across separate positions, each one increasingly vulnerable to isolation. So to understand Dublin at war, we have to move through those positions, because each stronghold became its own small world of fear, resolve, and collapsing possibility. At the center stood the General Post Office, the GPO, still the symbolic heart of the rising. Inside were Patrick Pearse, James Connolly, Tom Clark, and other senior leaders of the rebellion. This was both headquarters and emblem. As long as the GPO held, the Republic still had a visible center. But a visible center is also a target, and the British understood exactly what the building represented. Inside the GPO, the mood must have been a strange mixture of adrenaline and dawning realism. Orders were issued. Dispatches moved. Windows were watched. Men prepared for the next assault. But symbolism alone could not stop bullets. The building that had served so beautifully as the stage for revolution now risked becoming a trap. Then there was St. Stephen's Green, where Countess Markievicz and Michael Mallon held position with citizen army and volunteer forces. On paper, the green may have looked useful, open ground in a significant area of the city. In practice, it exposed the rebels to deadly fire from surrounding high buildings. This is one of those moments where romance collides headfirst with military reality. A park can look noble in the imagination. Under sniper fire, it becomes perilously exposed. The rebels there quickly learned that holding open ground against a professional army was a dangerous illusion. They dug trenches, remarkably, in the green itself, as though the logic of continental war had suddenly been dropped into an urban park. But the British occupied the Shelbourne Hotel, which overlooked the area, and from that elevated position they could fire down onto the rebels below. It was a sharp, cruel lesson in terrain. Idealism does not erase topography. At Boland's Mill, Eamon de Valera commanded his garrison. This post mattered because of its location, particularly its ability to interfere with British troop movement from the coast. Unlike some of the more visible positions in the city center, Boland's Mill became a place of grim vigilance. The men there endured long stretches of tension, watching, waiting, exchanging fire, holding their ground while the larger shape of the rebellion darkened around them. At the Four Courts, rebel forces under Edward Daly held another key position. This area too saw hard fighting as British troops sought to tighten control and cut the rebels off from one another. Elsewhere, at Jacob's factory, Thomas MacDonagh held his command, turning an industrial site into a fortress of temporary resistance. At the South Dublin Union, Eamon Sent and his forces fought fiercely in one of the most strategically difficult and dangerous engagements of the week. And that is something I want to pause on here. When we tell the story of the Easter Rising, it is easy to let the GPO swallow the entire event. The GPO is the symbol, the postcard, the monument. But the Rising was not one building. It was a network of separated positions, each filled with men and women living minute by minute inside uncertainty. Some saw direct, furious combat. Others endured the psychological torture of waiting for the full assault to fall. All of them were cut off from easy rescue, easy victory, and increasingly, from illusion. Meanwhile, ordinary civilians were trapped inside this unfolding urban war. And this is one of the most painful parts of the story. Dublin was not an empty chessboard on which rebels and soldiers moved their pieces. It was a living city. Families were in their homes. Workers were caught in the streets. Bystanders found themselves suddenly near firing lines they did not choose. Shops were looted. Windows shattered. Fear spread block by block. Civilian casualties mounted, and with them came a bitter complication for the rising. However noble the rebels believed their cause to be, the people of Dublin were the ones absorbing much of the immediate suffering. This helps explain why early public reaction was often mixed, skeptical, or openly hostile. The rebels were not universally embraced as liberators during the fighting itself. To many civilians, what they could see most clearly was disruption, danger, hunger, destruction, and death. The nobility of national sacrifice is much harder to admire when bullets are ripping through your street and the city you live in is beginning to burn. And burn it did. As the British response intensified, the use of artillery and heavier firepower transformed the battle. This is one of the decisive shifts of the week. Once artillery entered the picture, the rising moved from insurrection to devastation. Buildings could not simply be defended by courage. Streets could not remain symbolic spaces once shells began tearing into them. Smoke thickened. Fires spread. The center of Dublin began to look less like a rebellious capital and more like a city being broken open. Nowhere was this more apparent than around the GPO. British forces poured gunfire into the area. The building shook under sustained attack. The men inside, including Pearse and Connolly, were no longer merely directing a rebellion. They were surviving a siege. Connolly in particular emerged as a crucial military figure, composed and steady under immense pressure. If Pearse gave the rising its voice, Connolly gave it much of its nerve. And yet nerve was not enough. This is the hard truth that begins to settle over Section 4. The rebels fought with commitment. In many places, they fought with remarkable discipline. They inflicted casualties. They held out longer than some might have expected. But the strategic imbalance was becoming merciless. British numbers grew. Rebel communications remained limited. Positions became more isolated. Supplies ran thin. The dream of a nationwide rising had not materialized in the way the planners hoped. Dublin was fighting, yes, but much of Ireland was not erupting in synchronized revolution around it. So the city becomes a map of intensifying pressure. A republic declared from the GPO. Trenches scraped into St. Stephen's Green. Rifle fire from windows and rooftops. Factories turned into fortresses. Roads watched from mill towers. Smoke rising over Sackville Street. Civilians crouched in fear. British troops tightening the ring. And through it all, the rebels confronting the possibility that they had succeeded in beginning something far larger than they could control, but far smaller than they could win. That is the tragedy of Dublin at war. It was brave. It was chaotic. It was symbolically immense. And militarily, it was beginning to suffocate. By now, the rising had moved beyond spectacle. No one could mistake it for a dramatic gesture anymore. The city had paid too much for that illusion. This was war in the streets, and wars in cities have a way of stripping slogans down to their rawest consequences. The Republic had been proclaimed in idealism. Now it was being tested in fire. And in the next section, we arrive at the moment when the strain becomes unbearable. The city burns more fiercely. The positions begin to fail. The leaders confront the full shape of defeat. And the rising starts to collapse under the weight of the empire it dared to challenge. By the latter half of the week, the Easter Rising had entered its most painful phase. Not the opening act, where boldness still carried the thrill of possibility. Not the early fighting, where strongholds could still imagine themselves holding the line. But the slow and terrible realization that the rebellion was being crushed. This is the point in the story where idealism collides with arithmetic. Because courage can matter immensely in history. Symbolism can matter. Vision can matter. But in the middle of a military confrontation, numbers matter too. Artillery matters. Supply lines matter. Communication matters. Reinforcements matter. And by Thursday and Friday, those realities were closing in on the rebels from every direction. The British had brought overwhelming force to bear on Dublin. Troops flooded the city. Firepower intensified. Streets became increasingly impassable. Rebel positions, already separated from one another, began to feel less like coordinated outposts and more like islands waiting to be swallowed. And over all of it hung the smoke. This is one of the defining images of the collapse of the Rising. Dublin, particularly the city centre, darkened by fire, scarred by shelling, choked by destruction. The Republic had been declared in one of the most symbolically charged moments in Irish history. Now that declaration seemed to flicker inside a city being physically torn apart around it. Nowhere was that clearer than at the General Post Office. The GPO had been the heart of the rebellion, its political center, its symbolic core, its public face. But by the end of the week, it was becoming uninhabitable. British shelling and gunfire battered the building relentlessly. Flames spread. The interior grew more dangerous. The walls that had once framed the proclamation of the Republic now enclosed men who could feel the world collapsing around them. Inside, Patrick Pearse, James Connolly, and the other leaders were no longer simply trying to direct events. They were confronting the narrowing space between resistance and ruin. And we should pause here on Connolly, because few figures embody the final days of the Rising more powerfully. Connolly had always been one of the clearest military minds among the leadership. He understood discipline. He understood the cost of hesitation. He understood that brave rhetoric did not win street battles. And during the fighting, he had been indispensable. But as the week wore on, he was badly wounded, struck in the leg during the combat. That injury matters for practical reasons, of course. But it also matters symbolically. Because in Connolly, we can see the Rising itself. Still defiant. Still conscious. Still dangerous in spirit. But physically broken. And yet even then, the rebellion did not end in one sudden dramatic snap. It frayed. It tightened. It suffered. Each rebel position felt that pressure in its own way. At some outposts, fighters remained grimly determined, still exchanging fire, still holding rooms, windows, courtyards, and barricades. At others, men began to understand that their situation was no longer one of difficult resistance, but of near-certain defeat. Communications between positions were poor. Reliable information was scarce. Rumor traveled faster than fact. Some commanders knew little of the wider picture beyond their own walls and streets. Imagine how disorienting that must have been. To be told you are part of a national insurrection, while your own world shrinks to a staircase, a rooftop, a doorway, and the sound of enemy fire outside. And outside those positions, civilians continued to suffer. This is crucial. The collapse of the Rising was not experienced only by the men and women in rebel uniform. It was experienced by the people of Dublin, trapped amid fires, shortages, panic, and destruction. Homes were damaged. Streets were unsafe. Food became harder to find. The city was being forced to absorb the weight of a rebellion and the fury of an empire at the same time. This deepened the moral crisis for the rebel leadership. Because by now, the hope of military success was fading rapidly. The vision of a broader uprising had not materialized in the way the planners had imagined. Reinforcements were not coming in the needed form. British control was tightening. And every additional day of fighting meant more death, more injuries, more damage, and more civilians caught in the path of ruin. So we arrive here at one of the most difficult truths in the story of the Easter Rising. There comes a moment in many revolts when the question is no longer, can we still win? The question becomes, what are we willing to let this city endure in order to continue? And that is a different question entirely. For men like Pearse, this must have been an agonizing reckoning. Pearse believed deeply in sacrifice. He believed that an act of bloodshed could awaken a nation. He believed history often moved through martyrdom and memory rather than immediate success. But even a man drawn to sacrificial language still had to look at the burning city in front of him. Still had to see the dead. still had to reckon with the civilians paying for this confrontation. By Friday, the situation at the GPO had grown desperate. Fires had spread through the building, forcing the leaders to abandon it. Think of the symbolism of that moment. The headquarters of the proclaimed republic, the very building from which its existence had been announced to the world, now engulfed and untenable. The rebels were forced to evacuate, breaking through surrounding walls and moving through adjacent buildings in an effort to escape the inferno and regroup. That retreat was more than tactical. It felt like the physical unraveling of the rising's central image. The GPO was not merely a headquarters. It was the stage on which the Republic had first appeared. To leave it behind, smoking and shattered, was to watch the rebellion's grand public face begin to disintegrate. And yet even then, the leaders were not simply cowards scrambling from a doomed set piece. They were trying to preserve what remained of their command, to decide whether resistance still served any purpose, and to navigate a city in which every hour made the cost heavier. By now, many of the rebels had moved from the emotional world of daring into the emotional world of exhaustion. Not just physical exhaustion, though certainly that, but moral exhaustion. Psychological exhaustion. The exhaustion that comes when the idea that carried you into battle begins to share the room with evidence that battle has failed. This is what makes the collapse of the Rising so powerful as history. It was not one clean heroic tableau. It was smoke, pain, confusion, courage, error, conviction, and despair all crowded together. By Saturday, the Easter Rising had reached the point where courage could no longer alter the outcome. The city was burning. The rebel positions were collapsing or cut off. Communications were broken. Leaders were wounded. Civilians were dying. And whatever hopes had existed on Easter Monday, whether of wider national support, military endurance, or a prolonged insurrection, had narrowed into one final and unbearable question. Should the fighting continue? That question is easy to romanticize from a distance. History has a bad habit of making final stands look cleaner than they were. We imagine banners in the smoke. Noble speeches. Men choosing death with a kind of polished certainty. Reality is usually harsher. Reality smells like fire and brick dust. Reality sounds like gunfire in streets full of trapped civilians. Reality is not a painting. It is a decision made under pressure, when every option feels contaminated by loss. By this point, the rebel leadership understood that further resistance would not produce victory. It would produce more ruin. More dead civilians. More bodies in the streets. More destruction poured into a city that had already suffered enough. And so the moral burden of command shifted. The question was no longer how to win. It was how to end. That is the gravity of surrender in the story of the Easter Rising. It was not merely a military admission. It was an act shaped by responsibility, by defeat, and by the recognition that symbols, however powerful, do not justify endless bloodshed once the outcome is clear. Patrick Pearse ultimately made the decision to surrender. And I want to pause there, because Pearse is often remembered as the poet of the Rising, the visionary, the man of proclamation and sacrifice. But here, in the final act, he appears in a different role. Not as the voice of rebellion's birth, but as the man who must acknowledge its end. He issued the order to lay down arms in order to prevent further slaughter, especially of civilians. That detail matters. It matters because surrender is often narrated as collapse, humiliation, or failure alone. But in this case, surrender was also an act of restraint. A recognition that a doomed cause does not become nobler by grinding more innocent people beneath it. Pearse's formal surrender was made to Brigadier General William Lowe. And from there, the order began spreading outward to the other rebel positions. Imagine what that must have felt like. In scattered strongholds across Dublin, exhausted men and women who had spent days under fire, hungry, frightened, adrenaline burned, and clinging to shattered purpose, now receiving word that it was over. Some likely felt relief. Some despair. Some disbelief. Some shame. Some perhaps understood immediately that the rebellion had crossed into another form of power entirely. Others may only have felt emptiness. Because surrender has its own kind of silence. After days of shots, orders, smoke, and tension, there comes this strange hollowing out. The weapons are lowered. The waiting changes shape. The body is still full of fear, but now it has nowhere active to go. The fight drains away, and what remains is consequence. For many rebels, that consequence arrived quickly. They emerged from their positions and were taken into custody by British forces. The image is a painful one. Men and women who, only days earlier, had declared a republic and occupied the heart of the city, now marching into imprisonment under guard. Some Dubliners jeered them. That too is important to remember. At the time of the surrender, public feeling was not yet the reverent memory that later generations would cultivate. Many civilians were furious. Their city had been damaged. Their lives had been disrupted. Their families had suffered. The dead were real. The destruction was real. The rising, in that immediate moment, did not look to everyone like the birth of national glory. To many, it looked like catastrophe. And history often begins there, in misreading. Not because the public was foolish, but because people living inside an event can only see what is directly in front of them. They saw rubble. They saw hunger. They saw burned streets and armed escorts. They did not yet see the martyrdom to come. They did not yet see how British policy in the aftermath would transform the meaning of the week. For the leaders themselves, surrender did not mean safety. It meant stepping across a threshold into arrest, court-martial, and likely death. And here again, the rising reveals its peculiar structure. Militarily, it was over. Politically, it was only beginning. That is the paradox sitting at the center of this section. The surrender ended the rebellion in the streets, but it did not end the force the rebellion would exert on Irish history. In some ways, it intensified it. Once the rifles were quiet, interpretation took over. Meaning took over. Memory took over. The British Empire had crushed the insurrection, yes, but what it would do next would determine whether the rising died as a failed revolt or survived as something far more dangerous. And already, even before the executions, the outlines of that danger were forming. A proclamation had been read. A republic had been named. A city had burned. A surrender had been given. And now the rebels, defeated in action, were about to be recast by the machinery of state punishment. This is why surrender is not simply the end of the Easter Rising. It is the hinge. On one side stands the rebellion itself. The planning, the proclamation, the firefights, the smoke, the collapse. On the other side stands the afterlife of the rebellion. The trials. The executions. The transformation of defeated insurgents into martyrs. The shift in public feeling. The long, fierce echo that would move from prison cells and firing squads into the bloodstream of Irish nationalism. So when Pearse surrendered, he did more than end the fighting. He closed one chapter and opened the one that would make the rising immortal. In the next section, we move into that aftermath. The arrests. The executions. The British miscalculation. And the extraordinary way a failed rebellion began to win, not on the battlefield, but in memory. If the surrender ended the fighting, it did not end the story. In many ways, it was only then that the deeper political consequences of the Easter Rising began to unfold. Because once the guns fell silent, the British government faced a choice. It could treat the Rising as a contained military disturbance, punish its leaders with measured force, and attempt to restore order without deepening the wound. Or it could respond in a way that transformed defeat into legend. It chose the second path. In the days after the surrender, thousands were arrested. Not only those who had fought directly in Dublin, but many others suspected of nationalist involvement were swept up as well. Men were rounded up. Women were detained. Prisoners were processed, interrogated, and sorted through the machinery of imperial control. To the British authorities, this likely seemed necessary. Rebellion had to be stamped out decisively. A message had to be sent. And messages, as history teaches us, rarely travel only in the direction intended. The leaders of the rising were court-martialed, quickly and largely out of public view. The proceedings were not grand public reckonings designed to persuade the population. They were efficient instruments of punishment. The verdicts came swiftly. Death. One by one, the leaders were executed by firing squad in Kilmainham jail. And this is the point where the moral atmosphere of the story changes completely. During the rising itself, many Dubliners had been angry with the rebels. That anger was understandable. The city had suffered. Civilians had died. Buildings had burned. For many people, the insurrection looked like a reckless disaster. But executions have a way of altering scale. The rising had lasted less than a week. The memory of the executions would last generations. Patrick Pearse was executed on May 3, 1916. Then Thomas Clark, the old revolutionary who had spent so much of his life preparing for a moment like this, was shot. Then Thomas MacDonagh. Then Joseph Mary Plunkett. Then William Pearse, Patrick's brother. Then others. The sequence itself mattered. Each execution extended the shock. Each morning brought another death. Each death made it harder to treat the rebellion as a brief disturbance already finished and buried. The British were not closing the event cleanly. They were reopening it again and again with every volley. And then came James Connolly. Connolly had been so badly wounded during the rising that he could not stand for his execution. He was carried to the yard, tied to a chair, and shot. Even now, over a century later, that image lands with the force of a slammed door. Because whatever one thought of the rebellion, whatever one thought of Connolly's politics, that scene was almost guaranteed to produce revulsion. A wounded man, unable to stand, bound into place so the ritual of state killing could be completed. The British may have intended it as proof of authority. Instead, it looked to many like cruelty stripped of dignity. And with that, the emotional chemistry of Ireland began to change. This is one of the great miscalculations in modern imperial history. The British had defeated the rebels in military terms. That part was done. The insurrection was over. The city was under control. But rather than allowing public anger against the rising to cool into bitterness toward the rebels, the executions redirected that anger. The dead leaders began to appear less like reckless disturbers of the peace and more like men who had offered themselves to history. Men shot for an idea. Men who had failed in action, but who now seemed almost sanctified by the state's response. And this, I think, is where we must be very careful as historians. Martyrdom is powerful, but it is also dangerous. It can simplify complicated people into symbols. Pearse becomes the poet's sacrifice. Connolly becomes the wounded prophet. Clark becomes the old patriot. The dead are easier to revere than the living are to understand. Yet the emotional power of martyrdom is real whether historians are comfortable with it or not. The British did not merely execute individuals. They changed the meaning of the rising. That is the key. Before the executions, the rebellion could still be framed as a failed and unpopular act of wartime recklessness. After the executions, it increasingly looked like something else. A sacrifice. A national wound. A blood-marked claim to independence. And in Ireland, where political memory had long been braided together with older stories of rebellion, suppression, and martyrdom, this mattered enormously. The executed leaders did not vanish into silence. They entered a tradition. Their deaths were absorbed into the larger narrative of Ireland as a nation repeatedly denied, repeatedly punished, repeatedly called to remember its dead. The proclamation, which might have remained a strange document from a failed uprising, now gained a kind of sacred afterlife. Its words mattered more because the men who signed it were dead. Their signatures had become more than political. They had become testament. Public opinion began shifting. Not all at once. Not magically. But steadily. The British had hoped to crush rebellion by demonstrating overwhelming power. Instead, they had supplied Irish nationalism with martyrs, funerary gravity, and moral theater of the most potent kind. Sympathy widened. Anger deepened. The executions gave emotional coherence to what military defeat had left fragmented. And beyond Ireland, too, the story traveled. The world could now see not merely a colonial disturbance, but an empire shooting the leaders of a rebellion one by one after the fighting had already ended. That distinction mattered. It shaped perception. It sharpened the contrast between state authority and revolutionary sacrifice. So this section of the story is not really about death alone. It is about conversion. The conversion of defeat into memory. The conversion of failed insurgents into national icons. The conversion of a shattered week in Dublin into something much harder to suppress. By the time the executions ended, the British had restored control of the city. But they had lost control of the narrative. And that may be the most important political fact of all. Because nations are not made only by armies. They are also made by stories people decide must never be forgotten. The men and women of Easter Week had not won the Republic in 1916. But in death, the leaders of the Rising helped make the Republic imaginable to far more people than before. The rebellion had fallen. Its leaders had been shot. And yet, in the strange arithmetic of history, the cause had grown larger in ruin than it had been in battle. In the final section, we step back and ask the biggest question of all. How did one failed uprising, lasting less than a week, change Ireland forever? So now we come to the final question. How does a rebellion that fails in less than a week change the course of a nation? How does an uprising that is militarily crushed become historically triumphant? Because if we look at the Easter Rising only through the cold arithmetic of battle, the answer seems almost absurd. The rebels did not defeat British forces. They did not hold Dublin. They did not spark the kind of immediate nationwide revolution they had hoped for. Their positions collapsed. Their leaders surrendered. Many of those leaders were executed. By the ordinary standards of military judgment, this was a failed insurrection. And yet, history does not always bow to military judgment. Sometimes a failed rebellion changes more than a successful negotiation ever could. Sometimes an event loses in the streets and wins in the imagination. That is what happened here. The Easter Rising forced Ireland to confront a new political reality. Before 1916, the struggle for Irish self-government had often been framed, at least publicly, through the language of constitutional reform. Debate centered on home rule, on legislation, on what degree of autonomy Britain might permit, delay, or reshape. That world did not vanish overnight after Easter week, but it was wounded badly. The Rising made it harder to believe that Ireland's future would be settled only through parliamentary patience. It introduced a more dangerous idea into public life. That independence might not be requested. It might be taken. Now, the Rising did not instantly create a united Ireland. That would be too neat, too easy, too mythic. Public opinion shifted unevenly. There was still fear, disagreement, grief, political complexity, and regional difference. But the executions had altered the emotional field. Sympathy for the rebels grew. Admiration grew. Anger at British rule deepened. And from that shifting atmosphere emerged a broader appetite for Republican politics. This is where the Rising's afterlife becomes so important. Because 1916 is not the end of the story. It is the ignition point. In the years that followed, Sinn Féin, though not actually the organizer of the Rising itself, became closely associated in the public imagination with the cause of Irish independence. The old constitutional pathways began to lose authority. A younger, more militant, more uncompromising political energy entered the center of Irish life. What the rebels had declared in the GPO, others would now attempt to pursue through politics, organization, and eventually guerrilla war. By 1919, Ireland had entered the War of Independence. And you can feel the thread running straight back to Easter week. Not because the Rising had succeeded as a military blueprint. It had not. But because it had succeeded as a political and emotional rupture. It made an Irish republic imaginable in a new way. It clothed independence in sacrifice. It created martyrs. It supplied symbols. It supplied language. It supplied names. And most of all, it supplied a story powerful enough to outlive its own battlefield defeat. Eventually, that process led to the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921 and the creation of the Irish Free State in 1922. Now, even that outcome came at a terrible price. Partition remained. Northern Ireland stayed within the United Kingdom. Civil war followed within Ireland itself. So let us not make the mistake of telling this story as though the Rising opened a clean, golden road toward freedom. It did not. It opened a violent, fractured, unfinished road. But it did change the direction of travel. And that is why the Easter Rising still matters. It matters because it sits at the crossroads of so many forces. Empire and nationalism. Symbol and strategy. Poetry and gunfire. Public anger and public memory. Failure and transformation. It matters because it reminds us that history is not built only out of victories. Sometimes it is built out of moments that appear disastrous in their own hour, but which rearrange what people believe is possible. And perhaps most of all, it matters because of the strange power of declaration. That word matters here. Declaration. On Easter Monday in 1916, in a city still unsure what was unfolding, a group of rebels declared an Irish Republic. At that moment, the declaration was fragile. Almost absurdly fragile. It had little military protection. Limited public support. Uncertain reach. It was surrounded by forces far stronger than itself. And yet it was spoken. It was written. It was signed. It was defended. And then, in the executions that followed, it was sealed in blood. That does not make every choice of the Rising wise. It does not erase civilian suffering. It does not turn miscalculation into perfection. But it does explain why the event endured. Because the Easter Rising was never only about what the rebels could hold. It was about what they could set in motion. In 1 week, they shattered the illusion that the Irish question could be contained forever inside British political management. In 1 week, they gave Irish nationalism a new gallery of martyrs. In 1 week, they turned central Dublin into a scar that could not be forgotten. In 1 week, they altered the moral and political language of Irish independence. That is an extraordinary amount for 7 days. So when we remember the Easter Rising, we should remember it honestly. As a rebellion that was brave and flawed. As an event that was idealistic and destructive. As a moment filled with courage, confusion, suffering, symbolism, and terrible consequence. And above all, as a week in which a failed insurrection became the beginning of a new Ireland. That is the paradox. That is the legacy. And that is why, more than a century later, Easter week of 1916 still stands not merely as a chapter in Irish history, but as one of the great examples of how history can be changed by those who do not win, but who refuse to disappear.